Hey everyone. Tonight's journey takes us into one of the most disturbing corners of ancient Rome, behind the gilded doors of Emperor Caligula's palace. A place of excess, cruelty, and secrets too twisted for the history books. Forget the marble halls and golden laurel crowns. This was a world where pleasure was power, and freedom was a luxury only the emperor could grant. For those trapped inside his court, life wasn't decadent, it was survival. So, before we step into the madness, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy this kind of dark history told slow and honest. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always eerie to imagine how far across the world we all are, yet sharing this same story in the dark together. Now, settle in, maybe dim the lights, and let's descend into Caligula's palace, where power, pleasure, and pain all blurred into one. The Gilded Cage. You might imagine that being close to the Emperor of Rome meant luxury. Marble floors, silk sheets, gold cups of wine. But for the people trapped inside Emperor Caligula's palace, that same gold glinted like the bars of a cage. When you think of Caligula, the name alone conjures madness. The man who made his horse a consul. The emperor who declared himself a living god. The stories about him are so grotesque that historians still debate how much was true. But behind every legend was something worse. The quiet suffering of those who had no choice but to serve him. Let's begin at the gates of the Palatine Hill, around the year 38 CE. The palace is enormous, a sprawling compound of marble courtyards, shaded colonnades, and perfumed halls. Slaves shuffle silently through corridors, carrying silver trays or fanning the emperor's guests. Among them are the delitii, the delights, a word the Romans used for the young and beautiful slaves chosen for pleasure, decoration, or humiliation. They came from everywhere: Greece, Syria, Egypt, Thrace, captured in wars or purchased in the markets of Delos and Alexandria. To the Romans, they were not people. They were property, bodies to be used, traded, and discarded. Their names were often replaced with nicknames: pearl, dove, honey. You'd lose your name the day you were bought. Inside Caligula's palace, the atmosphere was not just decadent, it was suffocating. The emperor believed himself divine, a living god of pleasure and pain. He demanded entertainment that blurred the line between feast and punishment. At his banquets, guests reclined on couches draped in purple fabric, while slaves stood motionless for hours, holding golden lamps that smoked with myrrh. If one's hand trembled, or if a lamp flickered too close to his face, Caligula might order the slave's execution for offending the light of Rome. The delitii were not attendants, they were ornaments. Some were dressed in fine silk to amuse the guests. Others were stripped bare to be painted with gold dust and paraded like living statues. Their value was not measured by strength or skill, but by beauty, novelty, and obedience. The emperor's favorites might live for a season in luxury, jewels, perfume, laughter, but it was a luxury built on fear. One wrong glance, one sign of boredom, could mean death. Caligula was known to reward his slaves with riches one day and execute them the next, just to test the loyalty of the gods. Imagine, for a moment, being a young woman from the Greek coast, sold to Roman traders at 15. Your mother's voice fades behind you as the ship sails west. The deck smells of sweat, salt, and despair. Weeks later, you arrive at Ostia, Rome's harbor, and are led up the Tiber to the city of marble and fire. You are washed, oiled, inspected, and sold. The man who buys you doesn't even ask your name. You are taken to the palace and taught to walk silently, to bow deeply, to smile when spoken to. The other slaves teach you what to avoid. Never meet the emperor's eyes unless ordered to. Never speak unless spoken to. And never, ever cry in front of him. The palace has no night. Torches burn in the halls. Musicians play soft lyre melodies even after midnight. The emperor's laughter echoes through the chambers like thunder, followed by screams, sometimes of delight, sometimes of pain. The walls are thin, and the marble carries sound well. Most of the palace, slaves slept on woven mats in side corridors. The delicii were given silk couches, not for rest, but for display. They slept lightly, always half awake, waiting to be summoned. A silver bell might ring at any hour. When the bell rang, it could mean anything. Sometimes the emperor wanted a dance, sometimes a drink, sometimes a demonstration of loyalty that blurred the line between affection and cruelty. And yet, those who pleased him could rise. A slave might be given gold, a villa, even temporary freedom. But freedom was not always what it seemed. One former slave, a woman named Caesonia, became Caligula's mistress, then his wife. She gained power, wealth, and status. But her fate followed his. When Caligula was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard in 41 CE, Caesonia and their infant daughter were murdered moments later. Even in death, the slaves of Caligula's palace could not escape him. To the Romans, the emperor's household was a reflection of Rome itself. Powerful, extravagant, corrupt. But for those inside, it was a labyrinth of whispers, jealousy, and fear. Some found ways to survive, by learning to please without being noticed, to exist in the spaces between his gaze. Others were less fortunate. It's easy, from a distance of 2,000 years, to turn Caligula into a caricature, the mad emperor, the monster of Rome. But history's cruelty often hides in smaller things. The silence of a servant, the shuffle of bare feet across marble floors, the quiet sound of someone trying not to cry where no one can hear. And yet, even in that gilded prison, people found ways to endure. Some prayed to the household gods, even though they were forbidden to. Others carved tiny symbols into the stone walls, messages only other slaves could understand, marks of friendship, or perhaps resistance. Archaeologists have found similar graffiti in other Roman villas, scratched hearts, fish symbols, small names. Traces of human lives that refused to vanish entirely. If you close your eyes and listen to the echoes of Caligula's palace, you might hear the faint hum of the torches, the whisper of silk, the creak of marble floors. The air heavy with perfume, the faint metallic tang of fear. Because in the end, Rome was not just an empire of conquest. It was an empire built on people who had no say in their own lives. And as history would later record, when Caligula's madness finally turned against his own guards, those same slaves may have watched silently as their emperor's blood spilled across the very marble they had polished for him. But what did freedom mean to them after that? Where could they go? Rome was still Rome, and even the death of a god did not free his servants from their chains. In the ruins of power, the Delicii remained, beautiful, nameless, forgotten. And perhaps that's the cruelest truth of all, the machinery of pleasure. When we picture an emperor's palace, we often imagine freedom of indulgence, fountains of wine, silk-draped chambers, endless feasts. But behind every drop of perfume, every banquet, and every forbidden pleasure was an elaborate system of control, a machine of people, ranks, and rituals designed to feed one man's whims. To understand how it felt to live inside Caligula's world, we need to step beyond the marble and into the machinery that kept it all running. This was not chaos. It was bureaucracy disguised as decadence. The imperial household, an empire within an empire. Caligula's palace on the Palatine Hill wasn't just his home. It was a miniature Rome. Within those walls lived hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people, administrators, cooks, physicians, guards, musicians, artisans, and slaves. Every corridor, every courtyard, had its own hierarchy. At the top of the domestic structure were the freedmen, former slaves who had earned their liberty by serving loyally. They often managed entire divisions, finances, correspondence, or entertainment. Many of them were more powerful than senators, for they controlled access to the emperor himself. Below them were the familia Caesaris, the emperor's private household slaves. This group included everyone from scribes to stable boys. And below them, at the very bottom, were the Delicii and concubinae, the so-called pleasure class. These were the bodies that maintained the illusion of godlike opulence. In Latin records, there was no polite term for them. They were listed under inventories alongside rugs, lamps, and musical instruments. A typical palace ledger might read, 1 Syrian boy trained in dance, 2 Greek girls instructed in lyre and song, 1 Nubian woman skilled in oils and massage. To Rome, this was bookkeeping. The Delicii were selected carefully, not only for beauty but for obedience. They were taught not only to serve, but to amuse. Many came from cultures that Rome had conquered, Greece, Judea, Gaul, and carried with them languages, songs, and customs that entertained Roman elites with their exoticism. They were forbidden to form families or friendships that interfered with service. Yet human nature doesn't yield to decree. Beneath the official hierarchy, there existed an invisible network of compassion, stolen glances, quiet gestures of solidarity, secret codes whispered in Greek or Aramaic. Within this hidden network, a few survived by becoming indispensable. The ones who remembered the emperor's moods, the order of his rituals, or the secrets whispered by senators after too much wine. Information was the only currency that might protect you from the emperor's caprice. The economics of flesh. For all its grandeur, Caligula's Rome was obsessed with one commodity: people. At the height of the empire, the trade in humans was one of the most profitable enterprises. Ships from Africa, Asia Minor, and the Levant carried more than goods. They carried human cargo. Marketplaces like Delos were said to sell up to 10,000 slaves in a single day. Most ended up as laborers, farmers, or house servants. The rare few who matched certain physical ideals were filtered upward to noble households, temples, and finally, the imperial palace itself. A Delicia could cost as much as a country villa, sometimes more. Wealthy Romans saw their ownership as a mark of sophistication, much as others collected rare animals or fine glass. The emperor, of course, owned the finest of all, but with ownership came a perverse paradox. Those who served the emperor most intimately were also the most disposable. Pleasure in the Roman sense was not reciprocal, it was domination. Every act, every smile, every touch reaffirmed the emperor's control over life and death. Ancient accounts tell us that Caligula enjoyed theatrics of cruelty. He would order slaves to dance or recite poetry, only to mock them mid-performance. He demanded that even pain must entertain him. One Roman historian, Cassius Dio, records that Caligula once said, "I wish all Rome had but one neck, that I might strike it through." It was hyperbole, yes, but it reflected his truth. He wanted the power to destroy not just individuals, but the very idea of defiance. The slaves who lived through that did so by erasing themselves. They learned to become background, to exist in silence, to move with purpose but without presence. To live in Caligula's palace was to master invisibility. Rituals of the divine emperor. Caligula was obsessed with divinity. He believed himself the living incarnation of gods like Dionysus, Apollo, and sometimes even Venus. That belief infected everything, from the way meals were served to how people were expected to look at him. In his private halls, he recreated the myths of the gods, but twisted them into living performances. Slaves were made to act as satyrs, nymphs, or demigods in mock plays for the emperor's amusement. The performances were often brutal. Imagine a candlelit chamber, the air heavy with incense. The emperor reclines on a couch of gold and ivory, watching as costumed slaves reenact scenes of divine seduction or punishment. Sometimes the acts were symbolic, sometimes they were not. To displease him was dangerous. To please him could be worse. Yet, there were moments, brief, fragile moments, when the line between master and slave blurred. The emperor's moods shifted like weather, and for an instant, a kind word or a shared glance could make you feel human again. But such moments were fleeting. They dissolved as quickly as they came, leaving only the memory of danger. The palace as a prison. What made the palace unbearable was not only the violence, it was the monotony. Days bled into nights. There was no clear rhythm to life. Meals could last from noon until dawn. Slaves were expected to be awake whenever the emperor was, and Caligula rarely slept. Some claimed he feared the dark, others said he feared his own dreams. For the Deliciae, exhaustion was constant. Their bodies were objects of spectacle, their identities erased beneath perfume and powder. And yet, even in that world, there were tiny rebellions. Some found ways to hide food or wine to share with others. Some whispered songs from their homelands at night. Fragments of melody from Greece, Syria, or Nubia, echoing softly through marble corridors. These songs were not of Rome, but of memory, a faint reminder of who they once were. One Roman poet, later exiled, wrote that he heard such singing in the emperor's halls. Voices like ghosts through the stone, not praying, but remembering. Even memory was an act of resistance. The web of surveillance. Every movement within the palace was watched. The emperor's spies, called delators, listened in on gossip, laughter, even sighs. Informants among the slaves were rewarded with small privileges, a better ration of bread, a gold clasp, or exemption from punishment. This created a culture of fear so deep that trust itself became impossible. The palace was a world where every friendship could be fatal, every secret overheard. And yet, even here, humanity persisted. Historians describe how some slaves developed a secret form of communication using the tools of their trade. Musicians signaled danger through subtle changes in rhythm. Servants left coded marks in the dust on door frames. It was a hidden language beneath the emperor's chaos, the pulse of survival. And survival, for many, meant understanding the emperor's psychology better than he did himself. Caligula's madness, or Rome's reflection. It is tempting to treat Caligula as an anomaly, a mad tyrant in a sea of otherwise rational emperors. But Rome itself created him. He was the product of absolute power, a system where one man's whims outweighed laws, and suffering was a form of entertainment. The palace merely reflected the world outside its gates. The same cruelty that marked Caligula's household existed in the slave markets, in the amphitheaters, in the way the empire dealt with its conquered peoples. What happened behind the palace walls was simply Rome, concentrated, Rome without disguise. Caligula's reign lasted barely 4 years, but those years scarred the imperial household. Even after his assassination, the same machinery continued under new masters. The faces changed, but the system did not. Because the truth was simple, Rome needed its slaves. It needed them invisible, compliant, and forgettable. And so, after Caligula's death, the palace's routines continued almost seamlessly. The torches were relit, the servants retrained, the feasts resumed, as though nothing had ever happened. History would record Caligula as a monster, but the system that built him, fed him, and outlived him remained unpunished. The afterlife of servitude. What became of the Delicii after Caligula's fall? We don't know. The records vanish, as if they never existed. Perhaps some were freed, perhaps others were absorbed into the next emperor's household. Rome did not write the names of its victims, only its victors. But we can guess. The freedmen of the palace often took Roman names and melted into the lower ranks of society. The rest, the anonymous ones, disappeared. Yet their presence lingers in the artifacts, the graffiti, the faint scent of oils and cracked amphorae found by archaeologists centuries later. It's humbling to realize that even the grandest palaces were held up by the hands of the forgotten. You might wonder, how did they bear it? How does a person continue when they own nothing, not even their name? Perhaps because even within the machinery of cruelty, there existed one small, stubborn instinct: to endure. And endurance, quiet and unseen, is its own form of rebellion. Tonight, as you picture the palace, its endless corridors, its torches burning through sleepless nights, remember that behind every story of Rome's glory stood someone who had no choice but to serve it. They were not heroes, nor villains, but the invisible foundation upon which history was built. And that foundation, though buried, still whispers. When the god of Rome died, by the year 41 CE, Rome had grown tired of its god. For 4 years, the empire had lived under the fever of Caligula's reign, a rule of contradictions, gold and starvation, laughter and terror, divine proclamations shouted by a mortal voice. The streets still echoed with songs of the emperor's glory, sung by trembling tongues that dared not go silent. But behind closed doors, even his own guards whispered the same question: how much longer could this go on? Inside the palace, the signs of collapse were already visible. The marble gleamed as it always had. The torches burned through the night, but the laughter had changed. It came in short bursts now, nervous, sharp, edged with hysteria. The slaves could feel it before anyone else. Fear has a scent, and the palace reeked of it. The emperor's theater of madness. Caligula's days no longer followed any rhythm. He could wake at noon or at midnight, order a feast in the middle of the Senate's proceedings, or command his attendants to drag senators from their beds to perform for him. He spoke of himself as Jupiter incarnate, the living god of Rome. In the great hall, he had erected statues of the gods, their faces replaced with his own. He ordered the priests of Jupiter to bring him offerings, as though he were both man and deity. For the Delicii, this meant constant performance. Every gesture around him became ritual, every glance a prayer for survival. The emperor's moods shifted without warning. Some nights he demanded music, others silence. Sometimes he wanted to be worshipped, other times he demanded mockery, as if daring the world to defy him. One Roman chronicler claimed that Caligula once spent an entire evening pretending to hold court with the moon, addressing it as a fellow god while his slaves stood in silent attendance. It's impossible to know if the account is true, but it captures something deeper, the sense that reality inside that palace was no longer anchored to reason. And yet, even within that madness, the machinery still turned. Food was prepared. Floors were polished. The emperor's robes were washed in imported saffron water. The empire continued to function because thousands of invisible hands kept it moving. For the slaves, obedience became muscle memory. You didn't think. You reacted. You survived. The whisper of rebellion. In the winter of 41 CE, the murmurs began. Not among the slaves. They had long ago learned the price of speech, but among the emperor's own guards, the Praetorian cohort. They had seen enough. The endless executions, the humiliations, the purges, even loyalty had its limits. Caligula had turned on everyone, senators, priests, generals, and guards alike. He mocked them publicly, forced them into absurd rituals, even confiscated their family's property for his own amusement. According to Suetonius, one of his tribunes, Cassius Chaerea, had endured particular cruelty. Caligula mocked his voice, calling him sweet little girl and assigning him obscene passphrase during guard duty. It was meant as a joke, but it became a death sentence. Among the palace slaves, the signs of unrest spread quietly. The guards' eyes lingered longer, their voices lowered to whispers. The air felt charged, like the stillness before a storm. For the Delicii, there was no way to escape it. They could only sense the tension in the rhythm of daily life. Fewer orders, tighter security, more silence. Even the musicians played softer, as though afraid to awaken something sleeping beneath the marble. The Day of Blood. It was the 24th of January, in the 41st year after Christ's birth. A day that began like any other. The emperor had arranged a private performance in a small theater within the palace grounds. It was meant to celebrate a festival, though in truth, every day in Caligula's Rome was a festival of himself. The Delicii were there, as always, arranged like ornaments along the edges of the hall. They stood motionless, painted, perfumed, waiting. Some carried trays of wine. Others fanned the emperor with peacock feathers. The music began. Flutes, lyres, and the soft rhythm of drums filled the chamber. Caligula laughed, tossed coins to the audience, and demanded another round of applause. And then, as the play ended, a small group of guards approached. At first, no one noticed. They bowed deeply, as though awaiting orders. The emperor smiled, perhaps to mock them again. One drew close enough to whisper something. Then, without warning, he struck. The first blow came from behind, slicing across Caligula's neck. He stumbled forward, eyes wide, confusion etched on his face. A second guard plunged a dagger into his chest. What followed was chaos. a silence so complete that it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing, and then a wave of screams that shook the marble columns. The emperor's blood splattered across the mosaic floor, staining the golden sandals of his attendants. Some slaves froze in shock. Others fled. A few dropped to their knees, unsure whether to grieve or rejoice. For years, their lives had revolved around this one man, his whims, his cruelty, his madness. And now, in an instant, the god of Rome lay dying at their feet. His final words, historians say, were not recorded. Perhaps he said nothing at all. The aftermath, the hours that followed, were a blur of panic. The palace that had once been a stage for divine spectacle became a slaughterhouse of confusion. The Praetorians sealed the exits. Loyalists were hunted. Caligula's wife, Caesonia, was killed moments later, struck down while clutching their infant daughter, whose skull was dashed against a wall. Outside, Rome stirred in uncertainty. Some celebrated, others hid. The Senate met in secret, debating whether to restore the Republic or crown a new emperor. But inside the palace, among the Deliciae, survival meant silence. For them, the emperor's death brought no freedom. They were still property, now of no one, which was worse. The palace officials began dividing his possessions: jewelry, artwork, land, and people. Slaves were reclassified, reassigned, or sold. The marble halls that had once echoed with Caligula's laughter were suddenly quiet. The torches burned lower, unattended. The musicians had fled. The air itself seemed hollow. The palace in ruin. In the weeks that followed, the palace felt haunted. Servants whispered that Caligula's ghost walked the corridors at night, dripping blood, laughing softly. Perhaps it was only imagination, the echo of trauma left behind in those walls. But trauma has a way of settling into stone. The Deliciae who survived carried scars that would never heal. Some fled into the city, vanishing into Rome's labyrinth of alleys and tenements. Others were too marked, too known, to disappear. They remained, serving new masters who pretended the past had never happened. The poet Seneca, who lived through that era, later wrote, "When a god dies, the slaves must pretend the sky has not changed." That sentence captures everything. For the people who had lived beneath Caligula's shadow, survival meant pretending. Pretending the horror had been divine will, pretending that obedience still had meaning. The unwritten names. If you walk today through the ruins of the Palatine Hill in Rome, you can still see fragments of the palace, the foundations, the outlines of courtyards, the broken baths. Tourists stroll through the marble remains, taking photos, admiring the craftsmanship. But the stone keeps its secrets. Archaeologists have found tiny scratches carved into the walls of servant corridors, initials, hearts, fish symbols, crude drawings of ships. They are not inscriptions of glory, but of humanity. Someone once stood there, perhaps after a night of terror, and marked the stone to say, "I was here." These are the real witnesses of history, the silent ones, the invisible ones, whose names never entered the chronicles. Their legacy isn't in the marble, but in the endurance that carried them through something unspeakable. Because in a way, they survived their god. Reflection. Caligula's death didn't end the suffering of Rome's slaves. It didn't dismantle the system that made his madness possible, but it revealed a truth that echoes through every empire. When power becomes divine, humanity becomes disposable. The slaves of the palace never overthrew their master. They couldn't, but they endured him. And sometimes, endurance is the quietest, strongest rebellion of all. As the years passed, the memory of Caligula transformed into legend, exaggerated, moralized, retold as warning. But the people who lived his reality were forgotten. Perhaps that's how history prefers it. The powerful become myths. The powerless become dust. Yet somewhere, between the cracks of the Palatine marble, between the faint traces of perfume and blood, the whispers remain. And if you stand there long enough, in the ruins where a god once died, you might still hear them. The sound of bare feet on stone, the hush of breath held in fear, the quiet endurance of lives that history tried to erase. The empire of chains. When Caligula fell, Rome took a deep breath, but it did not repent. The daggers that ended his life pierced only one man, not the system that had built him. The marble halls of the Palatine were scrubbed clean. The blood was washed from the mosaics. Incense burned again. And beneath the smell of myrrh and wine, the machine of slavery continued to hum, quiet and relentless. A new god on the throne. Claudius, Caligula's uncle, ascended the throne almost by accident. The Praetorians found him trembling behind a curtain after the assassination, a man more scholar than soldier, dragged from hiding and proclaimed emperor before he could protest. He promised restoration, peace, sanity. But peace in Rome always demanded the same fuel: human labor. Under Claudius, the empire expanded farther than before. Britain was invaded, ports were fortified, aqueducts rose. Each victory, each architectural wonder, was paid for not in gold but in lives. The slaves who had polished Caligula's marble now hauled stone in quarries or died, laying foundations for Claudius's triumphs. Freedom, it turned out, was not contagious. Rome's dependence on servitude. By the middle of the 1st century CE, 1 out of every 3 people in Rome was enslaved. They were cooks, scribes, teachers, and doctors. They were builders, prostitutes, and entertainers. Some were treated almost kindly, others as beasts of burden, but all were property. Rome's brilliance rested on this contradiction, a civilization that worshipped liberty, built entirely on bondage. Its philosophers debated virtue while their servants poured the wine. Its poets sang of love while the enslaved bodies of others were traded as gifts between friends. Even the word family, familia, originally meant the household of slaves, not the bloodline of the master. Freedom, in Latin, was not a right. It was a status, purchased or inherited, fragile as glass. For the Deliciae, the pleasure slaves, the palace might have been the pinnacle of that hierarchy, but it was also its mirror. What happened in those perfumed chambers reflected what happened in every Roman household, only with more marble and more cruelty. The afterlife of pleasure. Long after Caligula's name became a curse, the idea he embodied remained seductive. Each emperor after him inherited not only his throne, but his appetite. Nero built golden houses where singers and slaves entertained through the night. Commodus staged gladiatorial games where palace servants were forced to die for spectacle. The emperors changed, the gods changed, but the pattern did not. Rome's elite learned that domination could be dressed as refinement, that cruelty could masquerade as taste. The art of pleasure became a political language, a way to display power through excess. Historians call this luxuria, but the Latin word means more than luxury. It meant the decay that comes when wealth forgets restraint, when humanity itself becomes another collectible. The Deliciae were not forgotten because they were rare, they were forgotten because they were everywhere. Freedom by coin. Occasionally, the empire offered small mercies. A slave could, in theory, buy their freedom, a process called manumitio. Some masters freed servants in their wills. Others sold freedom for a price. But even liberty came with chains. A freed slave remained tied to their former master as a client, owing obedience, favors, and public respect. Their children might rise higher, perhaps even become citizens, but the shadow of ownership lingered for generations. For those once bound in the palace, manumission was a dream few achieved. Their worth lay in youth and beauty, both temporary currencies. When age arrived, they were often replaced, resold, or discarded. Rome did not retire its servants, it replaced them. The unwritten histories. Ancient chroniclers, Suetonius, Tacitus, Dio, recorded every scandal of Caligula's court, the orgies, the feasts, the cruelty. They wrote about the emperor's madness in careful detail, but they left blank the lives of the people who endured it. We know the number of horses he owned, but not the names of the women who served his wine. This silence is its own kind of violence. It teaches us how easily whole populations can vanish from memory when their suffering is routine. The archaeologist uncovers bones and pottery shards. The historian interprets laws and ledgers. But between them lies an absence, a space filled only by imagination and empathy. It is there, in that absence, that the deliciae live on. Perhaps one of them escaped. Perhaps she stood years later in a Roman marketplace, veiled, watching senators pass by, and whispered to herself, "I knew your God before he died." We cannot prove it, but the thought lingers like a candle in a dark corridor, a tiny act of defiance against forgetting. Echoes across centuries. The Roman system did not end with Rome. Its patterns, the commodification of bodies, the hierarchy of worth, the use of pleasure as power, survived through empires and kingdoms. The markets of medieval Venice, the harems of Ottoman palaces, the plantations of the New World, each repeated Rome's old formula with new justifications. The words changed, but the structure endured, some born to command, others to serve. Even in modern language, echoes remain. We still speak of empire when we mean dominance, of slaves to desire when we mean obsession. Rome's ghosts linger in our metaphors. Every time history romanticizes the ancient world, its banquets, its grandeur, its marble statues, those ghosts stir. They remind us that beauty often sits atop suffering, that the glow of torches once illuminated chains. Lessons in endurance. If there is a lesson in Caligula's palace, it isn't merely that power corrupts. It's that ordinary people find ways to endure the corruption of others. The slaves who survived him did not overthrow the empire. They simply refused to vanish completely. They hummed their songs in the dark, scratched their initials into stone, shared stolen bread, passed whispered stories to the next generation. History remembers revolts. It rarely records endurance. Yet endurance is what fills the centuries between revolutions. To survive under tyranny requires a form of wisdom, a knowledge of silence, of reading moods, of knowing when to look down and when to look away. These were not lessons of books, but of bruises and sleepless nights. It may sound bleak, but within that bleakness is something deeply human, the instinct to live, even when life has been stripped of meaning. Rome falls, but the echo stays. 400 years after Caligula's death, Rome itself collapsed under its own weight. Barbarians sacked the city, marble crumbled, aqueducts dried. But the culture of hierarchy survived in every kingdom that rose from its ashes. When the ruins were rediscovered centuries later, poets wept at their beauty. They wrote of noble Caesars and vanished glory. Few wrote of the servants whose fingerprints still pressed into the bricks. In museums today, visitors admire the craftsmanship of Roman jewelry, unaware that many of those delicate pieces once adorned the necks of slaves. Even art, that supposed refuge of the free spirit, carries the memory of bondage. To look honestly at Rome is to accept both truths at once: its genius and its cruelty, its light and its shadow. Caligula was only the most theatrical expression of something Rome never truly questioned: its right to own the lives of others. A quiet reckoning. It is late now in our story. The torches of the Palatine have long gone out. The marble lies cracked beneath wildflowers. If you were to walk there at dusk, you might hear cicadas where once there was music, wind where once there were whispers. And yet, the place still feels inhabited, not by ghosts seeking revenge, but by memories seeking recognition. The air seems to hum with the lives that once filled it, a low, constant vibration of forgotten existence. To listen is to perform a kind of justice, because remembering the forgotten is the gentlest form of rebellion. So, as you lie back and let your mind drift, imagine those who once stood unseen in the emperor's light. Their world was cruel, but their endurance made ours possible. They are the quiet architects of history, the ones who held the weight of empire so that others could look up and call it divine. Closing reflection. When the god of Rome died, the world did not end. It simply continued, quietly rearranging its chains. And in that quiet continuation lies the essence of history itself, the stubborn refusal of humanity to stop existing, no matter how impossible life becomes. So, if this story has kept you awake longer than you expected, take comfort in this thought. The world has always been cruel and beautiful in equal measure, and every comfort we know today was purchased by the endurance of someone we'll never know. Perhaps, somewhere, in some cosmic sense, remembering them is the only form of freedom we can offer. The torches are fading now. The marble cools. Sleep comes softly, as it did for those who once prayed for a night without summons.